Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Murray Lecture. I'm really excited to have you all join us. We're just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to get in and get settled, and then we'll get started. If you're just joining us, welcome. I'm glad I'm really glad we're zooming in on this disgustingly cold night here in Nashville. We're just going to get started in about 1 minute once everyone's had a chance to log in. All right, it is 7:02, so I'm going to get us started because I want to make sure that we have lots of time to hear our lecture tonight and to have a chance for the discussion that we have planned. Welcome to the Murray Lecture. My name is Melissa Grisolfi. I'm the Dean of the Commons, and it's my honor to be hosting the lecture tonight. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the Murray Lecture and the person for whom it's named, and then I'll introduce our guest tonight. So, the annual Murray Lecture is named for the Reverend Walter R. Murray, a Nashville native and Pearl High School graduate who was one of Vanderbilt's first African-American undergraduates. During his time at the university, Murray served as vice president of the Student Government Association and was a founder of the Afro-American Student Association, now known as the Black Student Association. Murray later became the first African-American to serve on Vanderbilt University's Board of Trust, after being elected a Young Alumni Trustee in April 1970. He served on the board until 1972. In 1974, he earned a Master of Management from what is now known as the Owen Graduate School of Management, and later earned his Master of Divinity in 1986 from Harvard Divinity School. In 2007, in addition to establishing the Memorial Lecture, Vanderbilt named a residence hall at the Martha Rivers Ingram Commons in honor of Murray, who died in 1998. Tonight, to present the Murray Lecture to us is Dr. Lawanda Ward, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight, Dr. Ward. Dr. Ward is an assistant professor of education at Penn State. Her research focuses on critically analyzing legal issues in higher education, including race-conscious admissions, free speech, and academic freedom. Dr. Ward earned a PhD in higher education and student affairs from Indiana University, a JD from Indiana University, an MS in educational administration from Old Dominion University, an MA in political science from Illinois State University, and a BA in political science from Murray State University. Tonight, Dr. Ward is going to weave all of these areas of expertise together in her talk entitled Make It Make Sense: Racial Justice, Spirituality, and Law. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Ward.
Thank you, Dean Grisolfi, so much. And thank you to the Vanderbilt community for inviting me for this honorable event. I am overwhelmed and overjoyed to be in conversation with all of you tonight. I would like to also acknowledge and thank the Murray family, if there are any members in the audience here tonight for the lecture. So I want to start off by talking about the title of my talk, Make It Make Sense: Racial Justice, Spirituality, and Law. So after I received the invitation, I was very excited about this opportunity. And I immediately started, putting some thoughts together and thinking about what I could possibly talk about. And I was sharing with a good friend, a Black woman scholar, and I was saying to her, I've been invited for this lecture, and I'm thinking that I'm going to talk about racial justice, law, and spirituality, because the lecture is in honor of an African-American man who was among the first students, who's a Reverend. And so I'm like, I'm thinking about all these ways that I can draw and make connections. And she literally, she turned to me and she was like, sis, make it make sense. And so, we shared, we chuckled and we laughed. And I was thinking afterwards, I'm like, well, and I know she was joking with me and I explained to her more of what I was thinking, but I was like, I think I'm going to use that as part of my title, because it's possible that people are wondering in some ways, how do you bring these three concepts together in relationship? And if you do, what is their significance, if at all? And so in our time together, I am going to, and I'm not going to be lecturing, I'm going to be sharing some thoughts with you all and would love to, hear what you're thinking as it relates to thinking about racial justice, spirituality, and law, because I have some thoughts on how the three of those work together in ways that can make our campus communities better. So on the slide, I have photos of the early years of Reverend Walter R. Murray, who the lecture is named for. And on the right side is Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, who is an inspiration to me. And I'll be talking about Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray throughout my conversation, because their way of thinking about law, racial justice, and spirituality has really had an influence on me. But as I was reflecting, and especially thinking about how historically both of these individuals have had a indelible mark in US society, especially as it relates to racial justice, I invite you to think about these two questions that I have been thinking about as well. What are the costs? And we think about costs mentally, physically, spiritually, other aspects to being the first. Sometimes being the first isn't always an easy task, or it's not even always desirable. And so in reflecting and thinking about the time period in which both of the Murrays would have been younger and considering higher education, it wasn't a time where their presence, because of race, would have been welcomed. And so for them to embark upon the endeavors that they undertook in this moment in time in US history, what were those costs for them? And then a second question I invite you to think about is, what are the opportunities did the two of them possibly miss or forego because of their commitment to eradicating social justice, eradicating racial injustice? And I think about that question because in this time period, in this Black History Month, and we reflect and we think about Black people who have been the first and they've made sacrifices. But sometimes it's important to also think about what could they have possibly been doing if racial injustice wasn't so prevalent and they chose to focus on that to make things better. So in terms of thinking about spirituality, racial justice, and law, who are my sense makers? And hopefully my conversation of talking about who my sense makers are could possibly make you reflect and think about who they are for you. So when I think about who has helped me make sense of the role of law and race and spirituality in our lives, these are some of the people that I think about. Some of them you might recognize because they have national notoriety, and others perhaps not so much, but I will share with you who they are. So in the top left is another photo of Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. By today's academic language, Pauli Murray would be considered a masculine-centered queer Black woman. She was an attorney, she was a poet, in her late 60s became an Episcopalian priest and actually was the first African-American woman to do so. Reverend Murray coined the concept Jane Crow. And she did that as a reflection of the times where there was a lot of conversation around Jim Crow, which is a very masculine concept that really privileges and puts forward a way to think about what was happening with men. Reverend Murray, thinking in an intersectional way, which I'll talk more about that concept, brought to our attention the ways in which gender also has a role, and really even other social identities, and how those identities in relation to the power systems that we have in place make it so that people experience overt, blatant, and violent discriminatory practices. And specifically, Jane Crow was a way that Reverend Murray described the experiences of Black women. Reverend Murray is also the intellectual architect behind the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education. In that decision, the Supreme Court overturned a 58-year-old Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson, in which Plessy legalized separate but equal. And it was that legalization of racial discrimination stood for almost 60 years. It was in law school that Reverend Murray wrote a thesis believing and saying that the way in which Plessy would be overturned would be this focus on attacking the inequities that result in this notion of separate but equal. Her professor used that argument, or at least took that argument to Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP legal team. And they used Reverend Murray's legal rationale to help build a case for Brown versus Board of Education. And I always like to bring to people's attention the role of Reverend Murray in Brown versus Board of Education, because normally the conversation, and rightfully so, there's a lot of credit that's given to Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers with the NAACP. But for the intellectual labor of Reverend Pauli Murray, who provided that legal strategy, we might be having a different conversation. To the right of Reverend Murray is another Episcopalian priest, and this is Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, who was within the group of one of the first Black women to be ordained as an Episcopalian priest. Reverend Douglas's work is impactful to me because she writes about racial reconciliation, social justice, sexuality, and the Black church. And in particular, Reverend Kelly advocates that the church is a major component in terms of helping white people understand the harms of white supremacy. On the second row to the far left is law professor Patricia Williams, a law professor at Columbia University. And Professor Williams uses critical race theory, which is a legally rooted concept of a way to center and think about race and racism within the legal, within law. She teaches about the ways in which we can be thoughtful about how racism shows up as spirit murder, which I will talk more about as I share with you my thoughts on how I see racial justice, spirituality, and law being in relationship. To the right of Professor Williams is Ida B. Wells, a Black woman who was a journalist, a social justice activist, even before we were talking about concepts around racism. Ida B. Wells used the pen. She wrote about the injustices that were taking place. She heavily critiqued our US society as it relates to our government system allowing the lynchings of Black people, and specifically Black men. The bottom row, the left scholar, is Kimberly Crenshaw, which people might be familiar with her because she is known to be the law professor, the academic who coined intersectionality. She is not the person who helped us think about intersectionality, but she gave us the academic term. Black women have been thinking about ways of thinking about their multiple social identities as it relates to how they experience power structures long before Professor Crenshaw coined it for us. But she is credited for helping us think in an academic context about intersectionality. To her right is Angela Davis, another activist, someone who has helped us be very thoughtful about prison abolition, as well as someone who's helped us to think about history, the racial violence of the police and how that continues to be a part of our modern day experiences, especially for people of African descent. And then last, but definitely not least, is Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks, a scholar, an activist, gifted us with, or always invited us to be very thoughtful about systems of oppression, specifically giving name to white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. So these are just a few of the sense makers who I engaged their work to help me be thoughtful. And in particular, I have engaged their work to help me be thoughtful about the ways in which racial justice, spirituality, and law are in relationship. So I want to share with you the concepts that I'm using, or at least how I'm thinking about them. Sometimes we're in conversation and we use words and maybe we're not all on the same page about what they mean, but I want to be certain to share with you how I'm thinking about these different concepts so that when we're in conversation, there's an understanding of how I think about them. And if someone thinks differently, they can share that with me. So as it relates to racial justice, I think about that construct as an active investment and engagement in eradicating societal issues that were created historically and are maintained contemporarily by normalized white supremacy and the priority of whiteness-informed logics. Spirituality. So I want to share with you, I grappled with whether I wanted to use spirituality or religion. And I did some research and I read some work of some women of color who were writing about spirituality as it relates to women of color's health. And they talked about making the choice of using spirituality over religion. And it resonated with me because a lot of times, especially in the US context, when we use religion, we automatically think of these established practices and norms and ways of doing. And I know for me, as someone who identifies as a Christian, I notice in the US context that Christian privilege becomes a part of what people equate with religion. While we say that there's religious diversity, in a lot of ways, there's Christian privilege, and that tends to overpower even our interest in understanding how people practice and make meaning around religion. So I felt like spirituality is a better way and a more expansive way that provides more people to be in conversation with how they think about something greater than themselves, and then how people think about purpose in life. But when I think about law, I think about it as an organized system of norms and values that are rooted in Eurocentric logics of colonization, privilege, and oppression. And a lot of times law is touted as this source of equality and fairness and justice. But at the same time, it has been used to legitimize societal ills. And that includes the enslavement of people of African descent, pillaging and theft of indigenous lands, and the exclusion of women and racially and ethnically minoritized people from institutions of higher education. So law as a system, law as a concept that's used as a tool is very complex in many ways. In US context, we have a particular reverence around law, which to me has its plus and its minuses. More so, minuses are when we don't use a historical lens to think about how we get to certain laws. And so I invite us, and this is me as well, to always be thoughtful about if a law is brought to our attention as being useful, especially in the context of racial justice, what is the root or the roots of that law? What has it been used for historically? Who created it? were there multiple voices that had a role in thinking about how that law would come to be. And then racism. Racism is a crime against people that causes spirit murder. And this is a concept that Columbia Law professor Patricia Williams talked about in a writing in 1987. She talked about the ways in which racism is an offense and that it's deeply painful and assaultive. And she advocated for us as a US society to really have a more expansive perspective around the harm that racism can do. So when I think about spirituality's role in law and racial justice in US higher education, I think back to purpose in life, which the concept of spirituality offers us. And in my perspective, all persons should be afforded opportunities for exploration without fear of spirit murder that's caused by racism. And when we think about institutions of higher education, they're all very welcoming. Vanderbilt University, including Penn State University, University Park, and I would argue to say all US institutions have these very eloquently written statements about inclusion and respect and being welcoming, and that students from all walks of life, experiences, and social identities are welcome. In that context, that makes me think about a community. And so campus communities should be these places where students can explore the purpose of life and have their spirits affirmed. So for me as a scholar and the work that I do, and even someone when I don't have my scholar identity at the forefront, I think about spaces where all people can be in those spaces and not have fear of being discriminated against or harassed based on race, sexual orientation, gender expression, any of the other identities that we have that historically and contemporarily, if they don't align with a particular perspective, that those people could potentially experience harm. My hope is that we create campus communities where that doesn't happen. And then thinking about laws and policies, that they should be interpreted to provide and promote spirit affirmation. Again, thinking about all of the eloquently written diversity, mission statements, values, the time and energy that institutions put into articulating to current students and prospective students how they will be treated in the space. In my opinion, laws and policies need to be interpreted to be in alignment with the promotion of spirit affirmation. So in 1979, Reverend Pauli Murray gave a sermon at the Church of the Atonement in Washington, D.C. And one of her statements really resonated with me, especially as it relates to thinking about this relationship of spirituality, law, and racial justice. Reverend Murray said, "True community is based upon equality, mutuality, and reciprocity. It affirms the richness of individual diversity, as well as the common human ties that bind us together." And within that statement, and as you can see, I have highlighted equality, because equality is a concept within legal discourse and ways of thinking that we tend to use quite a bit. We say the law as a system has been designated as one that will provide fairness, equality, that law confers upon us different rights, and that if we have been harmed in some sort of way, we can turn to law for justice, for redress. And so again, in thinking about campus communities, when there's racial injustice and it's left unaddressed, or even if it's normalized as part of the college experience, it deprives members of the campus community the right to experience a harm-free education. It can cause, and it does cause, spirit murder. So I want to briefly talk about an example that's a part of my scholarship that I write about. And not that just I think about as a scholar, but also as a Black woman who has mainly worked at historically white institutions, and thinking about what is my experience on campus, as well as what is the experience of other students on campus. So One example I want to talk about is when acts, whether it's speech or behavior, it's identified as hate speech. So the campus president will say, this is hate speech. This has happened in our campus community. We do not condone it. It's not a part of who we are. And then they say, but it's free speech. And they provide that language because the dominant discourse is that, yes, that was hate speech or even hateful, but we still want to give it the protection of free speech. And when that happens, it can and it does cause spirit murder to members in campus communities. And that happens because we have to think historically, who are the groups that have been told you do not belong? The US institutions of higher education, especially the ones that are predominantly white, they're not spaces for you. Without that message of exclusion being communicated over time, and then here we are in 2022, and messages that are dehumanizing to people are still communicated, but they're told that qualifies as free speech. It's very harmful, and it doesn't align with these eloquently written diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. Legal and policy interpretations that focus on spirit affirmation, and I want to believe that institutions like Vanderbilt, Penn State, and others, that is the message that they want to send to students. If that is the message, and we believe, or I do believe that it is, then it can result in racial justice if legal and policy interpretations focus on spiritual affirmation, which means the interpretation is going to take into consideration what has happened to certain populations of our campus communities. We're going to be thoughtful in terms of how we interpret law and policy. So one of the ways that I go about thinking about law and its role in higher education, and really it can be applicable for any space, but because US higher education is the context in which I live and am in community with students, faculty, and other members of the Penn State campus community, I aim to, and this is an ongoing effort for me, and I would say anyone else who takes it up, is to develop a critical conscious legal literacy. And I've written about that, which I provide the citation. And it's really three components to engaging in a critical conscious legal literacy. One is to develop a knowledge about law's socio-historical foundations and its lasting vestiges. Again, the very roots of law are Eurocentric, white supremacist, heteronormative, sexist. Again, not all voices were able to contribute to our early thinkings about law. It was mainly wealthy white men who used their norms and values and perspectives to create law. And unless we're intentional about understanding the socio-historical roots of law, we will miss the opportunity to provide our students with campus communities that are affirming to them. I invite people to challenge the use of legal precedent, especially when it doesn't align with equity efforts and resistance to revisit policies. I'm not suggesting that people go to law school. I love it when students take my class and they say, you know, Dr. Ward, I thought this class, you know, legal issues in US higher education, I thought it was going to be all about legal jargon that I could not understand and I would not be able to follow. And I'm so glad when they say, I understand. I understand how you helped us think about history, how you help us think about that it's everyday people who are creating laws, and that one interpretation doesn't have to stand as the interpretation, especially if it's one that doesn't align with equity efforts. And then lastly, advancing a humanity and spirit affirming policies that are going to result in campus communities where everyone can feel as though they're welcomed. Again, I'm not advocating that people go to law school. But I am advocating that people ask questions, especially ask questions when you are told the law says this. It's always an opportunity to ask, but what if we interpreted the law or the policy in a way that better aligns with our equity efforts? So I'm about at 30 minutes, which is the time for me to share my thoughts. But I want to conclude with this question for all of us to consider. And you'll notice that for the photos, I've provided us with the ones that are further along for both of the Reverend Murrays in their careers in terms of what they've done. It's not the pictures of them when they were younger or undergraduates, but it's more so at a time when they've accomplished things in their lives, especially around racial justice, guiding people spiritually to think about how they not only can be better people, but how they can be people who are contributing to a community in the context of a global community. So I ask people to consider the question, how can we make it make sense in our spheres of influence with racial justice, spirituality, and God and law guiding our efforts? So thank you all for indulging me for these 30 minutes. And now I am very interested in hearing what questions and what remarks people have made as it relates to hearing how I think about racial justice, spirituality, and law. Thank you.
Sorry, I was saying thank you so much, but apparently I was muted. I want to give everyone a chance. So first of all, I wrote this in the chat, but if you could just share your thoughts and your responses just using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and then we can read those aloud and talk about them. While people are thinking about those responses and their own questions, I guess a question I would start with is if you could share an example. So the idea of sort of like developing, challenging, and advancing in hate speech, I think is a sort of general example. Is there an example from your experience, from your life, that you can use to sort of share with us about how you reinterpreted or interpreted differently what was happening in a way that actually did sort of support what is the opposite of spiritual affirmation? Like the opposite.
Right. So instead of spirit murder, the spirit affirmation.
Yeah.
So I actually give an example in the U.S. higher education context, and I'm not saying that. So I'm going to give an example with Purdue University, where the president there made a decision that a student's speech rose to the level of being harmful to the campus community and decided to expel the student. Now, there was a lot of debate around the president's choice because, again, people were saying, well, what they said was hateful, but it still warrants First Amendment protection. And the president disagreed with that. They said, in this campus community, we want people to feel safe. We want them to feel welcome. And so I'm making the decision that this student's choice of, and it was a couple of instances of what they said, is outside of the type of campus community that we're trying to establish and how we want people to feel welcome. So in that instance, which is in most instances as it relates to the difference between free speech and hate speech, someone's making an interpretation. Because when we think about the First Amendment and what the framers of the Constitution gave us, they just gave us the eloquently written rights. And we have empowered the US Supreme Court to make interpretations for us. Well, at one particular time in the Supreme Court's history, it was very attentive to racism, and it spoke to the ways in which certain language did not warrant First Amendment protection because it was racist, and it had a very negative and spirit-murdering impact on people of African descent. Well, when you fast forward and in this context, there's a lot of conversation around we're post-racial and that there are isolated incidents of racism and that there isn't a systemic or structural phenomenon that's in place. And so again, interpretation is always one of those, or it is something that it depends on how something gets interpreted. And in my opinion, presidents and other leaders in campus communities who are in a position to make interpretations that align with equity and inclusion efforts, they're making a different interpretation than the one that's current, which says, well, people were offended by that, or, you know, that was hateful, but it still has First Amendment protection and we can't do anything about it.
Thank you. It's a lot to think about. It's so many different perspectives and issues to sort of hold together and balance. There's a question that's actually, I think it's a different question, but it's similar tension. So the question is, how can we have these conversations in a way that's inclusive when spiritual affirmation, when most times spiritual support for Black students on campuses, including Vanderbilt, is centered around Christianity?
I like that question because, you know, as I said earlier, Christian privilege is real. And it's very real in the US higher education context. Many institutions of higher education, they, in their original founding, were connected possibly in some way to religious entities. And even if they weren't, they had a commitment to educating white men so that they could become clergy. And so because of that foundational connection of religion and US higher education, even though, you know, we've said we've made a disconnect, in a lot of ways we have not. And Christian privilege tends to show itself all the time and in many ways. And I think that question is one that I am grappling with. I just started writing with a colleague about the experiences of trans students in the classroom, where in this particular example that has me thinking about it, is that a professor, under the guise of saying that they were a Christian and they have the religious right not to believe that people can be trans. And, you know, unfortunately, the legal interpretation was, you know, yes, there was an infringement on this professor's free religious rights. And so for me, I'm like, whoa, big, like red flag. This is Christian privilege showing up in all of its ways, whereas it gets to be used as a cloak to be discriminatory and spirit murder people. So, you know, in a perfect world, what would happen is those who are in a position who provide spiritual guidance for students would have a consciousness around Christian privilege and would work not to promote that or to talk with students in ways in which they felt like that's what was happening. Unfortunately, I don't think we draw enough attention to that. I think we are continually telling ourselves, when I say we, I mean higher education, that no, Christian privilege isn't a thing, but it really is, and it's harmful. And I wish more institutions would pay attention to it in ways not to harm students.
Thank you. There's a question that's in the chat that actually I think is a sort of like, and one more example from what you're talking about right now. So the question is, how does this relate, what you're talking about, to interracial discourses, such as the prominence of the Black church within the Black community? And how has it led to the policing of the Black bodies of women?
So again, and in my experience of thinking about the Black church, I do identify as a Christian, but I do my best as much as possible not to use it as a way to be discriminatory in ways that I know it's being used. The policing of Black women's bodies, the church or religion in general has been used as a cloak to do that. It's been done not only by those who identify as men, but by those who identify as women. I think the work of, and I mentioned her, Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, helps us think about the Black church. Yes, it provides a refuge and spirit affirmation, but if there isn't care taken, the logics of sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of those systems of oppression will show themselves. And unfortunately, they do have the power of the law in some ways validating them. So I think it's important as we have conversations about racial justice, we also bring in what will happen if we eradicate racism. Then we're on a very good track to eradicate the other isms that serve to oppress and especially to cause harm. Hopefully that gave my thoughts on that particular question.
Thank you. So here's a different kind of question. So when someone you're talking with uses hate speech, racist language, or evident microaggressions, how do you recommend that you should respond personally? And I will say, let me just, there's another similar question that sort of adds one thing, especially because these conversations can become very emotional and end up as a debate about our personal identities.
Correct. So I would say the person should make a decision if they want to engage and respond to that. Because I think as those of us who inhabit Black bodies, safety should be our first priority. And even though, you know, we have the law to back us up in many instances, in that moment, if someone is aggressively making a point about hate speech being covered by the First Amendment, or that it should be, I think that person should use wisdom in determining whether they're going to go back and forth with them. And not only because of physical harm, but also the mental and emotional harm that goes with those types of conversations. Because, and I use this example, you know, our value valve or our bandwidth, we're conscious of it in a lot of ways. So if I came to this presentation and I was attempting to make an argument about the benefits and the pleasures of having sex with underage children, I would be disconnected likely. You know, we have a value valve that some things we say, there's no academic or there's no invitation for intellectual engagement about. There are certain topics that we say they're off limits. We don't find value in debating and discussing them. Unfortunately, at this current moment in the US context, there seems to be value, or at least people are saying that there's value in debating the use of assaultive speech, especially against people in Black and brown bodies. And I would say to that person, use wisdom. You know, debating and discussing your personhood with someone, that's not an intellectual conversation. That is pure dehumanization, because no one should be invited to defend their personhood.
Thank you. So a less emotional question, but that's a shift. So, so here's a question. The burden of understanding the socio-historical context of laws seems to often fall on students in academic settings, particularly within traditional law school structures. Do you have recommendations for how students can raise or offer conversations with faculty administrators to shift those expectations?
Yes, like that question too. So, and I want to talk a little bit about my law school experience, which overall helped me to understand law and legal workings. But I was not exposed to Polly Murray, Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Harris, any of the legal scholars, Black women who helped me be thoughtful to think about law. And law school legal education is rooted in Eurocentric logics. And so I would say students who want to take that on, and that is a take on project, I think you have to be prepared for resistance. Because again, in many instances, especially in law school, It's very formulaic. I thought I was going there and we would have, discussions back and forth. We would be invited to, think very thoughtful about how to challenge certain laws, especially the ones that haven't necessarily helped us move toward racial justice. And that doesn't necessarily happen in law school. That doesn't. And legal scholars have written about that. They were like, looking to the law to be the tool to help us achieve racial justice might not be the answer. That we need to look beyond the legal system and as a society come together and figure things out. So if I was still in law school and I was thinking about taking it on in terms of talking to the administration and talking to the faculty, I think I would corral with others. I know the Black Law Student Association is a body in law school where like-minded students of African descent recognize that law school wasn't a place that was meant for us. And so for us to make it, we need to come together. And so perhaps talking with others who have those same concerns about asking the administration and the faculty to be more thoughtful about teaching students how to eradicate racial injustice. Now, I would say the students need to manage their expectations because, unfortunately, that's not the norm in law school for that to happen. It's, like I said, it's very formulaic and very Eurocentric in nature, which has been normalized, and people aren't necessarily interested in making the types of changes that need to happen. But kudos to, if there's a law student out there who's planning to do that, I support you. I do support you.
So here's a question about the other side of sort of the law experience. So this question says, first of all, thank you for your candor. Dr. Ward, as a fellow IU McKinney law grad, it's great to see you and hear about the intersection of racial justice, spirituality, and law. With Justice Breyer retiring from the Supreme Court of the United States, do you see topics of racial justice and spirituality expanding or making it to the Supreme Court for arguments?
Shout out to a McKinney alum. I think I know who that is, but I won't say because I do believe that there are several who are on here. I don't have optimism around that. The court is currently conservative anyway, as it relates to the majority. And so with Justice Breyer retiring and with President Biden being in a position to nominate someone and they be elevated to the court, there's still not that majority that's needed to necessarily move the needle in terms of thinking about racial justice. And, unfortunately, Justice Thomas, who is considered to be the race expert on the court, takes a very color evasive approach to what's happening in society. His perspective, he's one of the main advocates of race no longer being used as a consideration in race conscious admissions, which the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the consolidated cases for students for fair admissions. So I actually am not very optimistic about the majority justices having a philosophy that considers race and racism and their role in the current experiences of people and the types of cases that are brought before them that invite them to think about those concepts as very well being active in not only people's lives, but in our society. So I'm not very optimistic about the majority perspective of the court changing, which again is an opportunity for those of us who are in higher education or who are community activists to push in our societal context, because law and society has this relationship where we get to push and we get to say, here's how we want laws to be interpreted. Here's what's important to us as a society to move us forward. And we invite the law to come on board and do that with us. And that's ebbed and flowed and happened throughout time. So I think we're going to spend more of our time outside of law thinking about how to make change and for things to look different, especially as it relates to racial justice.
So speaking of which, I'm going to ask my own question.
Sure.
I hold the mic, but asking you to put on your other hat, which is to think about education. another place where we can think about racial equity is in the educational sphere, but lately, the very questions of thinking about and engaging with concepts of racism, historical racism, structural racism are getting pushed out of schools and schooling. And I was curious about like whether there are legal perspectives that can be brought to bear on this conversation that helps us think about whether or how education can be a place. You might imagine education is a place where we actually do engage, have the opportunity to engage in change. So I was just curious about, since you have expertise in both of those fields, how this particular issue is coming together for you and what you think might happen.
Yes, so myself and many other scholars who engage critical race theory, because it's currently under attack and in the media, misunderstood, mischaracterized, the list goes on. You know, we're using it to help us push back to say, these conversations, it's a particular, you know, the conservative movement is putting money, time, and energy into distracting us for the real societal issues that we need to address. And race and racism, or at least the use of race and racism as a phenomenon, are still very relevant for us to do something about. And so many of us are writing about, you know, this is what racism looks like. It is the refusal to recognize that systems and structures that are in place continue to disenfranchise people, and we need to do something about it. And so when we say, or at least when it's said legally and policy-wise, that you can't teach about racism, you can't teach about Black History Month, it really goes to show the type of commitment, unfortunately, there is for us to remain a society where the racial hierarchy is in place, which means whiteness is privileged, the ways in which whiteness makes meaning of the world is privileged. And for myself and others, you know, we're pushing back and we're saying, this is a prime example of racism itself, with attempting to deny all of us as US citizens to engage with the historical realities that are still a part of the ways in which we experience life. And so, yes, and you know, education being one of the major societal institutions where knowledge is created, where we get to, especially in US higher education, we get to promote and produce knowledge. The attack is heavy in this space because people understand if people have knowledge and they start to ask questions, there's going to be some demand for changes. And so there's an agenda that's working very hard to keep the status quo at play.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one last question, and I think this is a question that really helps us all to think about what we can do. So the question is, you mentioned mentors that have inspired and guided you on your journey. Can you speak to how you create community among other scholars, or if you're a student, among other people and allies that are doing similar research or have similar commitments?
Yes. So, you know, I went to my high school reunion. I think it was the 20th year one, and I got voted the person with the most education. And I kind of laughed, but then I kind of felt like that might be kind of sad. But as I think about, I pretty much, once I left high school, I came into higher education and I never left. And along the way, I gravitated toward people who challenged me in my thinking. You know, I'm from a very small town, Henning, Tennessee. Shout out to Alex Haley and Roots. And I grew up in a very Christian conservative home. And so when I left for college, I tended to engage with friends, and mostly what students do, people who thought like me. But once I got into graduate school and even law school, people started to invite me to think differently. And so I encourage any student or any person who's in the Vanderbilt community and the larger Nashville community, if you want to grow and be challenged, then you start to seek out people who are talking about the things that you want to know more about. And I've been very fortunate that Black women have mostly showed up and what we call gathered me. They've said, okay, Lawanda, you know, you're not thinking about that in the right way. Let me introduce you to some literature that helps you be thoughtful. And, that's what's supposed to happen. So ideally in the Vanderbilt community, and if people are at other institutions, you are being intentional in seeking out classes that resonate with you, because likely there will be like-minded peers in those spaces that you can be in community with. And then, mentoring, sometimes we always think about it in a hierarchical way, but even I'm learning that mentorship can also, happen where it's peers. And so again, we're all in a position where we can learn from others, especially if we want to learn about racial justice, about doing more to affirm people's spirit than contribute to the murdering. So, being in community, classes that resonate with you, professors who are doing work that interest you, there's a lot of different ways that we can receive mentoring. It's not always in this formulaic way where you sign up for an opportunity and you get paired with someone. I think we can be intentional in more informal ways.
Thank you for that. I think that's really inspiring. And I mean, it would have been lovely if you'd been able to come to our campus and meet with students. One of the things that we have at Vanderbilt that's really incredible are just the most amazing student orgs. And I feel like a lot of the activism on our campus is student-led and student-driven. There's a lot of room for change and a lot of great work that people are doing. And so I feel like, while Vanderbilt, I think like other places, has work to do and ways to get better, one of our strengths is the commitment of our students. And in those communities, I think there's a lot of people who are doing, incredible things. So hopefully next time you can come in person and you can meet.
I know, I would love to come in person, absolutely, and meet and talk with students, faculty, and other administrators, especially to hear how people are continuing the legacy of Reverend Murray and others who have been trailblazers there. Again, going back to my slide about, what were the sacrifices that they had to make? Because there were sacrifices made to be the first, especially in that context.
Yeah, no, there were for sure. And that's a interesting thought experiment, and also a really, tragic thing to start to think through. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been such an interesting conversation and such an interesting set of ideas to think about. I feel like we don't often have an opportunity to talk to someone who themselves has these intersectional research interests, right? Where you can start to weave together different questions that apply to different fields and different areas of expertise. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Everyone be well and take care.
Yeah, have a great night, everyone. Thanks for joining us and take care.
Take care.